So my name again is Molly Freed. I'm a manager on our US program at RMI. I'm joined today by Nelson from Clean Tomorrow and Bradley from the Land and Liberty Coalition. I'm actually going to let them do their own introductions later. We all agreed during our pre-meet that it's a bit like having happy birthday sing to you when someone else just reads your bio aloud. So I'm sparing everyone that experience. The intention of this webinar is in general at a high level to move beyond the content that you've likely seen covered in many of the siting and permitting webinars that we all probably have attended in the last year. I think it's been pretty well established that state siting and permitting is a barrier to deploying energy infrastructure, that it's holding up our ability to meet demand, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're hoping to answer today is kind of now what? For a variety of scales and audiences, what does it actually look like to take on this issue? And what can we learn from the states and communities that are really on the learning edge here? So I'll start by speaking about a new tool that we launched earlier this month to support states that are trying to take action on permit reform. Then we'll move to Nelson, who will be talking about how states that have already started to tackle this problem through legislation are faring in that process and what we can learn from them. And then Bradley will be completing the picture with an overview of how these state reform attempts trickle down into the actual communities and projects on the ground. And as I said, we'll save 10 or 15 minutes at the end for questions. So please feel free to submit those throughout. So I'm going to kick us off, as I said, with an overview of our new state power permitting tool. For those that are unfamiliar with RMI, we are a nonpartisan nonprofit with the mission of transforming the global energy system into one that is clean, prosperous, and zero carbon. So we've been working in the siting and permitting space for years, but largely focused on transmission and interconnection and more like local and community issues. So the publishing of this tool is actually one of our first forays into the state permitting space, and I'm really excited to talk about it here today. I also know I said that we weren't going to be like the other siting and permitting webinars, but I will take 3 minutes here just to level set on context, assuming that's cool with everyone. So we know that electricity demand is growing in the US for the first time in decades. Forecasts are projecting 25% by 2030 and potentially 3 times that by 2050. Peak loads also projected to increase dramatically as well. And this graphic shows, some of the influencing factors here, including data centers and electrification. Fortunately, at the same time that there's this increasing need for new power, the cost to build clean power has decreased. We're seeing cost for solar declining over 80% from 2009. Wind is down 55% over the same period. So we have supply, we have demand. What is preventing fast deployment and causing, all these high electricity prices that we're seeing in the news? We all know it's a very complicated picture. It's a lot of things. It varies significantly across the US, wildfires in California, the need for new transmission infrastructure. But the one thing that does remain true across the country is that if we do not build more capacity to meet rising demand, it could make prices rise even higher. So why aren't we building faster? Partly it's because of the lengthy process of getting through the increasingly crowded interconnection queue. You can see here where energy developers clearly saw the signal of cheaper energy and entered the queue ambitiously here. And then even after clearing the interconnection queue, we're seeing developers sometimes wait years for the grid upgrades necessary to connect to the grid. So even if a project is one of the 23% of projects that makes it through the queue, the median time for them to reach commercial operation after their interconnection agreement is 35 months, almost 3 years for those built in 2024, which is up from 11 months in 2007 and 19 months in 2015. So just to make sure you caught that earlier statistic, that's 77% of the projects that entered the interconnection queue between 2000 and 2019 were withdrawn by 2024. So that's a massive quantity. And those projects, along with the ones that cancel or withdraw after receiving their interconnection agreement, are what ultimately brings us to siting and permitting. Because what we see is basically why are energy developers facing delays and canceling their projects? We're going to show a few slides from an LBNL study, and that found that outside of interconnection, the two most impactful factors were local ordinances and community opposition. And the same is true for project delays. So while the interconnection queue can feel fairly intractable of a problem, pretty daunting for state and local decision makers, there are things that these stakeholders can and should be doing within this whole crazy tangled mess to provide developers with the speed and the confidence that they need to really hit the ground running after they emerge from this queue process. So that's why we decided to create the state permitting power tool. We knew that this was a problem that could be addressed at the state level. However, after we did a literature review of all of the incredible resources from nonprofits and industry groups and think tanks about what could be done to reform the process, we really realized that the world probably did not need another state policy menu. So the resources you see on the screen, along with many others that aren't pictured, served as a launch pad for us to create something that we believed would be more action-oriented for the hypothetical, busy state-level decision maker that's in the audience here today. So we read dozens of reports and ended up identifying 4 primary buckets of barriers that energy developers face in the state permitting process. We have complexity, where the process has been identified as uncertain or inconsistent. We have delays, where the timelines are slow or unconstrained and ambiguous. We have political hurdles, where the success or failure of a project is influenced by political motivators rather than the technical qualifications of the project itself. And kind of financial hurdles writ large, where costs or risks inherent in the permitting process undermine the overall project economics. So whereas, all the interconnection problems that we just discussed can feel outside the scope of or ability of state and local level policymakers to address, these are tangible barriers that can be addressed at the local level to meaningfully drive projects towards faster deployment and more economical. So after going through and identifying all these barriers, we surveyed thousands of pages of those policy menus and solution sets, many written by people in the audience today, to identify 98 unique policy solutions that directly address the barriers highlighted in the last slide. We categorized them under 12 different reform categories and backed them up with 22 different example policies that have already been deployed across the US. Rather than show you a bunch of screenshots or risk my internet crashing by pulling it up, I'm going to let my colleague Anna walk you through a use case for the tool in this short little video.
Hello, and welcome to RMI's new State Permitting Power Tool. The goal of the State Permitting Power Tool is to narrow in on a specific permitting-related challenge and review potentially relevant reforms, all in less than 3 minutes. To begin, navigate to the Permitting Power Tool tab. From there, scroll down to the section where you can define your challenge and identify relevant reforms. This is a simple and effective way to move from a specific issue to targeted solutions. First, you'll narrow down the subset of challenges based on the primary impact you're concerned about. There are several categories to choose from. For this example, I'll select complexity and lack of clarity. Next, you'll choose the type of challenge. If you don't see the right fit, you can click back to step 1 to adjust your selection. In this case, I'll select inefficient permitting processes and review design. From there, you'll move to the next step, reviewing filtered challenges. You'll see a table listing relevant challenges along with their impact category and the number of associated reforms which might address that barrier. Once you select a challenge, a list of matching reforms will appear below in step 4. You can browse these directly or use the optional drop-down filter to further refine results, defining a reform type of fix, streamline, or deregulate. When you identify a reform of interest, you can click on it to view additional details, which will populate automatically. With that, you have identified a suite of solutions applicable to your unique challenge, which can be explored depending on political philosophy, preferences, or available resources. All results can be easily exported to a CSV file or PDF for your convenience. Now we'll walk through the additional tabs on the landing page and talk a bit about how we built this tool. At the top of the landing page, you'll see 5 tabs. The first is the permitting power tool itself. The second is the Challenges tab. Here you can browse over 40 identified permitting challenges. You can search using keywords or filter by categories such as impact type and challenge category. These categories emerge from our meta-analysis and allow users to more deeply understand the permitting landscape by narrowing in on individual barriers' primary impact or driving cause. Once filtered, you can either export the data as a CSV file or scroll down to view the table that includes the challenge, impact type, category, source, and associated reforms. You can also click on a specific challenge to view a list of related reforms identified in RMI's meta-analysis. Moving to the All Reforms tab. This allows you to browse 98 novel permitting reforms that we identified in our meta-analysis. Similar to the All Challenges tab, you can filter results using dropdowns, such as reform type, level of government, category, and technology type. Like our challenges, we sought to categorize reforms by key themes or differences that emerge, like whether the intent of the reform is to fix, streamline, or deregulate the permitting process. The Definitions tab provides explanations for each of these categories that are available as filters in the All Challenges and All Reform datasets. This helps clarify how items were categorized as you work through the tool. And finally, to view the underlying literature and sources used to compile this data, you can navigate to the Sources tab and follow the available links. This tool is based on a meta-analysis of over 1,000 pages of permitting literature, case studies, and policy resources from nearly 40 sources published since 2023. RMI synthesized these sources to identify common challenge and associated reforms. We first distinguished between overlapping and distinct challenges in the permitting process. Then we selected the appropriate level of granularity to group related issues to still preserve their meaningful differences. This process helps surface broader themes across states, highlight the most persistent challenges, and identify reforms with the greatest potential to address them. Reforms were then mapped to specific challenges and categorized by type: fix, streamline, deregulate, level of government, and thematic focus, enabling users to efficiently move from a defined challenge to a curated set of potentially relevant reforms. If you have any additional questions regarding the tool, do not hesitate to reach out to us at states@rmi.org. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for demonstrating that, Anna. She did work in radio, we asked after she sent that recording, which you can tell, I think. We are super excited about this tool and the opportunity that it creates for states that are just starting to explore the possibilities of permit reform, and really hoping that they'll start with the tool rather than reading all 40 reports that we cite. As far as next steps, great. We will be providing support to states that might get to that opening screen of the tool that asks, what are my barriers, and say, how should I know? So we'll be exploring a combination of quantitative assessments, developer interviews to really drill down into providing an accurate diagnosis so that states are actually solving for the right problems, not like square hole round peg situation. We also plan to identify policy mechanisms that states can use to ensure that the tax and employment benefits from the construction and operation of these projects are actually flowing to the communities in which they're sited. And then critically helping to equip developers and county level officials with the communication tools that they need to pass that information on to residents and make them supporters of these projects. And then finally, we've seen around the country the ways in which some state siting and permitting reforms are not actually resulting in the impacts that were anticipated or hoped for. So we're planning to collect insights from some of these early adopters to further develop a concept of what actually good policy reform looks like in this space. Not, going beyond like a checklist exercise of we did permit reform, but develop an impactful set of policies and programs that results in more projects being built faster, and more informed and enriched communities that host them. So if you're interested in partnering with us, there we go, on any of these topics, please feel free to reach out to me. I put my email on the slide here. I can also ask Matt to put it in the chat. But with that, I will pass it along to Nelson, who will be telling us exactly what we are starting to learn from these early and kind of emerging state examples.
Hi, everyone. First, I'd really like to thank RMI for creating this very cool tool and for hosting me on this webinar. As Molly mentioned, my name is Nelson Falkenberg. I'm the Siting Policy Manager at Clean Tomorrow, where I lead up our Siting Solutions project. The Siting Solutions project is a research and analysis initiative where we make sense of energy siting and permitting policies and design new and novel siting approaches for states. Another thing we do at the Siting Solutions Project is keep an eye on all of the legislation that's moving through state houses. For my piece of this presentation, I'll provide some context on recent state siting legislative trends, then zero in on a few states where we've been working this year and some of the policy debates that have been happening, and then close by talking about some of our resources that are feeding into this great tool that RMI has created. So I'll be speaking a bit to both the policy and the politics of siting. So the first thing I want to highlight is some of the legislative trends. Legislators right now are really grappling with this issue of siting reform to address all of those barriers that Molly mentioned at the start. Last year, we tracked and analyzed 300 plus siting bills and assessed their potential impact on renewable energy deployment, categorizing them on this spectrum here from very restrictive to very permissive. We released the findings in our 2025 legislative roundup report, and the biggest, most stark takeaway was that there were more than twice as many restrictive bills introduced as permissive ones. And despite all those bills introduced in 2025, very few actually passed. Only about 1 in 10 or 30 bills passed their legislatures, most with a neutral impact, and restrictive and permissive bills about broke even. Interestingly, the states that passed siting bills were all trifecta states, where the one party controlled the House, the Senate, and the governor's seat, which reflects two things we think. First is like how hard it is to actually pass this kind of siting reform in non-trifecta states, and then also the lack of some of the policy nuance and middle ground on this particular topic, which we in RMI and other folks are trying to bring to these state conversations. So this is just diving a little deeper into some of the states that passed siting reforms in 2025. Last year, Indiana, Ohio, Oregon, and Illinois all passed permissive reforms. Indiana's Senate Bill 425 included some tech-agnostic permitting changes. Ohio's omnibus energy legislation included brownfield siting for energy projects and local zoning without state review for smaller projects. And then Oregon passed 3 bills to make modest improvements to siting in the state. And then Illinois, which isn't actually included in this map because they passed their bill in October, adopted the Clean Reliable Grid Affordability Act to include clear guardrails for local governments to site battery energy storage projects. Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas, and Oklahoma also passed reforms, but on the restrictive side. And a silver lining there is that those bills could have been a lot worse than they were, and a lot of the most restrictive bills died in the House or the Senate. And then the last couple states, South Carolina and Maryland, passed siting reforms, but their impact is kind of ambiguous. It's not exactly clear how they'll affect deployment. And this year, moving to 2026, we're tracking more than 170 renewable energy siting and permitting related bills across 38 states. So still a very hot topic. And this is a short session year where some legislatures like Texas are not in session. And then others are adjourning early, right around now, so that their legislators can begin campaigning for the midterms. And given both those factors, this is a really still significant number of bills. So far, we've seen a similar number of permissive and restrictive bills introduced, and a few permissive bills have actually passed already in Oregon, Virginia, and Washington. So in Virginia, a couple of the notable bills that passed this session reduced barriers to renewable energy siting in the state. So HB 891/Senate Bill 443 in Virginia streamlines co-located battery storage siting by making them a permitted accessory use by right, which then allows those projects to bypass more lengthy local approval processes. Virginia's House Bill 711 establishes statewide zoning ordinance guardrails for solar projects and mandates that local governments have a special review process. While this provides some certainty to developers, permitting authority remains at the local level, and permit denials or incompatible ordinances have to be appealed, which is really a costly and time-intensive process. But either way, we think that HB 711 is a step in the right direction, and I'll get to this on the next slide. We're interested in more reforms in Virginia in the future. In Oregon, legislators passed House Bill 4031, which is a really unique policy solution to the problem of the impending end to federal renewable energy tax credits. This bill creates an exception to the requirement of obtaining a siting certificate from the state siting council for qualifying renewable energy facilities that meet those federal tax credit requirements. And this would then significantly streamline the siting process by reducing permitting timelines and regulatory risk for those projects. And that bill was signed by Governor Kotek in March. In Washington, Oregon's neighbor, House Bill 1960 passed and was signed by Governor Ferguson earlier this month. The bill enables renewable deployment by amending tax policy to encourage permissive local siting through a new excise tax incentive. Local governments aren't eligible to receive the revenue from that tax if they don't permit renewable energy projects using a model ordinance developed by the Department of Commerce. Put another way, a local government can only access that tax if they have a ordinance that is based on that Department of Commerce model ordinance. So despite these wins, there is restrictive legislation still advancing, especially in the South. Alabama, Mississippi, and Missouri all introduced some pretty significant restrictive legislation. And again, Oklahoma is outstanding in this regard, not in a good way. They've introduced 6 restrictive bills in this session alone. And then, well, the last thing I want to mention here is there's some particular elements of restrictive legislation that we want to highlight. These are punitive statewide zoning standards, adding additional steps to the permitting process to make it more time-intensive and costly, expanding local control over renewable energy permitting with no state backstop or safety net, and then outright bans or statewide moratoria on renewable energy technologies. So what's coming up in the future? Right now, we at the Siting Solutions Project are active with coalitions of stakeholders in key states, including Iowa, Colorado, and Pennsylvania. So I just wanted to highlight some of the debates that are happening right now. In Iowa, 2 bills are advancing through the House and the Senate. These are similar guardrails approaches that adopt setback requirements, permitting updates, vested rights, and other elements. Senate Majority Leader Klimesh has been one of the biggest champions of permissive siting reforms. And these kinds of bills show that this policy can advance in red and purple states. And just to pull back the curtain a little bit, the Iowa legislature is still active. They have eclipsed their 100-day planned session and are now forgoing their per diem because they have to get some things done. And one of those things is potentially siting reform. The Supreme Court in Iowa just released a decision on vested rights, and the Iowa Utility Commission also released a decision clarifying state preemption of local siting. And so there's kind of a lot of chaos in Iowa right now, and folks are trying to figure out where permitting reform fits into this, where siting and permitting reform fits. In Colorado, industry, environmental groups, and local governments all contemplated siting reforms this session, but the timing wasn't right to get something done. The expiration of federal tax credits, with the expiration of federal tax credits, developers are really concerned about how potential reform could set off a backlash among local governments, right at the time when permitting certainty and predictability is especially tenuous. And local governments were also really skeptical of any involvement from the state due to distrust of the governor and his staff over other policy issues. It's likely these groups will all be back to the bargaining table in 2027 under a new governor. In Pennsylvania, another state that we're working in, Governor Shapiro introduced his lightning plan to speed up permitting and deployment of renewable energy in Pennsylvania, including House Bill 502, which is called the Reset Bill. The bill was tech neutral and would have created a state permitting authority for any energy generating facilities over 20 megawatts. However, local environmental groups thought the bill would have allowed expansion of natural gas development and then worked to sink the bill in the House. A new bill is now emerging using a guardrails approach. And in a split legislature, Republicans control the Senate and Democrats the House. Compromise on this is going to be extremely difficult. It's possible that a renewable specific version will pass the House and a tech neutral version will advance through the Senate. Other states are on the horizon in 2027. Wisconsin, Texas, Virginia, Indiana, Ohio are all considering siting reforms. And as these states pick up the mantle for their siting reforms, we think that the policy tool RMI is creating will be a useful resource for considering different policy options. Really quickly, I'm running short on time here. I just wanted to mention the work that we've done at Clean Tomorrow and the Siting Solutions Project that were inputs into RMI's policy tool. And this is from our siting policy field guide. So we developed 6 principles and 4 models for effective siting policy design. And I'm just going to flash these up on the screen and I can share our field guide in the chat. But we think that as the tool reflects, there's not a single best siting policy and there's no silver bullet, but by incorporating these 6 principles and our 4 models of siting policy design, along with, obviously the tool that RMI's created, we can create something with states that allows us to overcome a lot of these barriers. So thanks for your attention. I just have one last point to wrap it all up. Legislators are really reacting to the trends that RMI described, increasing demand, restrictive local siting, cancellations and delays, but introducing a lot of mostly restrictive siting bills. This is moderating in 2026, and we're trying to help policymakers find a better path by using principles and models. And we think RMI's tool can bring better options to the table. Now I'm going to pass it off to Bradley at Land and Liberty Coalition, who is going to talk a bit about the role of local validators in bringing this state policy to ground.
Thank you, Nelson. And Molly, RMI team, thanks for having me on today. Excited to share a bit about the work that we've undertaken on local siting, particularly around our guidebooks campaign that we are running. That's in both states that have local zoning and statewide siting. But just by virtue of introduction, quickly, Bradley Pichet, I'm the National Director of the Land and Liberty Coalition, have been with Land and Liberty for about 6 years now, and my background is formerly in politics, did campaign work, and then also worked in the legislature in Michigan, both for the majority leader and for the appropriations chairman. And I'm enjoying considerably now campaigning on behalf of wind turbines and solar panels instead of candidates. So that was a joke. It's always tough making jokes and you can't see anybody's faces. But nonetheless, moving on. To explain a bit about the work that we do, I think briefly I just want to frame up sort of who we are and why. So the Land and Liberty Coalition is a conservative-based nonprofit project that does rural right of center engagement to build support for clean energy projects. It's important to note, too, that we're part of a larger organization. It's a big tent called the Conservative Energy Network, where there's 26 states, 13 of which are Land and Liberty. But in those 26 states, we also do state policy and state regulatory engagement as well, with the Land and Liberty message frames largely revolving around property rights, rural economic development, national security, and grid resiliency. And folks like myself who come from a conservative background operate as trusted messengers that live in and around the community where these projects are being built. The project kicked off in 2018, a few years after CEN formally was launched. Actually in the wake of a lot of really good permitting reform that came in some of the Midwest states, whether it be permitting reform or rural or renewable portfolio standards, among other things, noted that the rubber was really meeting the road in local communities, and that's where a lot of the objections were coming to pass. And our model is basically that we need to be a trusted messenger. The industry alone can't handle this as the only trusted messenger, the only messenger alone. And that's where we can step in and help bridge some of the gap where there might be some. So our goal is to build renewable ready communities. Like, ideally, we come in and start engaging these folks before a project is before them, before there's rumblings of an imminent project, so we can have conversations around renewables in a more ethereal way. Again, whether that's in a state where there's statewide siting or authority having jurisdictions or counties or townships. But the idea is to get in ahead of the opposition that is always inevitable, unfortunately, and counteract that with some supporter groups as well. Just to demonstrate sort of the breadth of the work that we've done, we've had about 15 gigawatts of clean energy projects that we've helped get across the finish line working with industry partners. And then we've operated in well over 100 authority having jurisdictions and in different counties in governing bodies as well. So moving on to our guidebooks, which is sort of the crux of what I wanted to talk about, sort of why this exists and what we have been doing with these and what we are hoping to do, and of course the lessons that we've learned. So our origins are in this guidebook campaign, which are guidebooks for local officials, whether it's the ones that actually have jurisdiction oversighting these projects, or states like, say, Wisconsin or Minnesota, where the counties don't have a formal process or a formal place in the process, but are still obviously influential actors as well. So we want them to understand the process that these projects undertake. So we started the program before we created this guidebook for individual states in all 13 of our states in Michigan and Pennsylvania for a couple reasons. One, both of those states are the only two within our footprint where the authority having jurisdictions are townships. So incredibly diffuse, well over 1,000 different governing bodies for these projects in each state, which is a major challenge. And then also we anticipated that at least in Michigan, once we launched these campaigns, we knew that there was siting reform that was going to be moving through the legislature that year. Unlike counties where it's a little bit more clear on information sharing and resources that are available and sort of the way that county officials are tapped into their broader county official network, the townships are far more diffuse. I mean, even in Michigan and Pennsylvania, there are townships with just a few hundred people, and it's a lot. There's resources that are lacking, and we wanted to make sure that we presented them with some resources that were unbiased and didn't necessarily come from a developer who wanted to see a project get done, or from a state regulator who was there to push through policies. And it's important too that the way that we engage this is initially, at least, without an explicit ask. So we can inform and share information with these folks without explicitly saying, hey, we're developing something or we want you to do something for us. Just for reference, in Michigan, where there's about 1,200 townships, we distributed about 900 guidebooks, and that went to different officials throughout townships, but then also to some of the counties where townships had ceded their authority for permitting these projects to the counties. And then in Pennsylvania, we distributed about 550 of these guidebooks as well. We're tracking through, we're trying to at least, where these have had a material change, and it's been good thus far. I think, in Pennsylvania, we've seen a handful of townships proactively passing ordinances that are permissible and work for them. And then in Michigan, it's a little bit murkier because, as I'll mention, there's a lot of movement, but also the state has told them that they have to. So I like to think that our guidebooks are helping even more than the state saying you have to do this. Again, another joke, but we'll move on to Michigan. The case in Michigan was really interesting. So a few years ago, the state enacted into law PA 233, which mandated authority having jurisdictions to pass what are called compatible renewable energy ordinances. Along with that process, they also created a new process with giving the MPSC the ability to permit those projects under certain circumstances if the townships or counties did not. And then after the law was enacted, there was a lot of confusion, and I think there still remains to be some, even so much to say that there's pending lawsuits that are moving through the process on what townships and counties are responsible for, what's too far, what isn't enough to be considered a CREO. And then, of course, there's just the examples of counties not wanting to do this. This was another instance where uh, it was Democrats in Lansing that passed legislation that was a needed reform, but these right-leaning communities largely were seeing this as something that they were being told what to do by folks in the Capitol. And the nuance was lost. And I think that without help from us and a handful of others, the message was lost that, hey, this is still an opportunity for you to create local policy in your own image that's like, yes, there's a mandate from the state, but there's also opportunities for you to balance what you see as the most important elements of local control with what's required by the state. Similarly, in Illinois, we've done guidebook distribution, and it's a similar story as in Michigan, although this happened a few years prior, where there were county zoning that was impermissible, and there were instances of moratoria that were preventing projects pretty rampantly, particularly downstate. Ford County, I think, was one of the catalyst examples of making things more challenging to get stuff done. And through CEJA, House Bill 4412 was passed, which basically created guide rails for counties that they had to fall within. An example being 50-foot setbacks from property lines. And similarly, rural officials felt like they weren't heard. They felt like it was another mandate. And then even though it's been even longer, ongoing denials, lawsuits, and then county pressures continued. We launched a couple of years ago in Ohio an 88 county tour where all of our teams were distributing guidebooks across, in the wake of SB 52 to educate local officials on sort of what their rights were and why maybe it doesn't make sense to create exclusion zones. Now in Illinois, our team is doing the same thing to help kind of push back and create another narrative that, like, yes, this was a law that came and passed in Springfield, but you still have opportunities here, and here's how you can balance property rights and your conservative values without running afoul to the law itself. So, sorry, double skip there. Some cautionary lessons, and I think one of them is being that a lot of the laws that we had seen come into pass over the last couple of years were pretty partisan in nature and like, unipartisan at that. Michigan and Illinois are two good examples, and so it's important to calculate the political risk there, and understanding that, yeah, you can get it done, but there's going to be some defiance. It's, there's some challenges that can come within there. And that's, that as we've seen in Michigan as again, the defiance and the lawsuits. Additionally, it's a couple bullets down, but the way that this issue is now less of a fringe, nuanced, niche issue that it was just a couple of years ago. This is a kitchen table issue now, particularly with the affordability issue, and more so in states where this has passed. For example, not to dive too much into the midterms, but we know that some of the gubernatorial candidates in Michigan have made this a major focal point of their campaigns. Without naming names, I know one of them has indicated that there's an interest in perhaps stacking the MPSC and adding our friend Kevin Martis to the board. So that would be a real challenge. If Kevin Martis, not great on the MPSC. That wouldn't be a fun time. And then we've seen folks as well that I think are generally trying to do good, but are co-opting the property rights message in particular, that especially when it's coming from folks that are known to be on the left of center and aren't identifying with these rural conservative folks. Genuinely, it can feel sort of patronizing or disingenuous to be like, well, we're protecting your property rights by passing these things. Like, that might be true, that, we're protecting farmers' property rights by ensuring that there's a durable process to get things done. But I think honing in on who the effective messenger is on that kind of messaging is important. And then the last thing is that this can boomerang, that just because you've got a good bill and a good law that's in place, things can change, and they can change quickly and dramatically. It's not a coincidence that I put a bunch of Ohio county courthouses up here, because that's a good example of how things can boomerang. We had a pretty durable and predictable process through the OPSB until things changed after SB 52, and it's been tough sledding there pretty much ever since. But there's good news. We still have things that we can take from lessons learned in these rural communities. As I've mentioned a few times, the message and the messenger matter. So when you have the right messengers out there delivering effective key points to rural conservatives, things can get better, and they're more willing to trust it. Secondly, the revenue question has been a challenge, I think, for a lot of folks, that especially in states where it's private property taxes that are used to assess the value of a wind or solar project. That's not exactly the most consistent, and it can be assessed differently from county to county. So places like Michigan, where they're actually built into the law when it's done and passed locally, that there's a pretty explicit way that the funds are distributed and that's collected, or with PILTs or pilots, depending on the state that you're working in. That can be really helpful too, because it takes that question out of it. There's also a conservative case to be made on business certainty, that these are rural job creators. People always say, well, they're only temporary job creators, but temporary job is still better than no jobs, and I will take that to the bank. We want to create business certainty for these folks, and that's a good thing, especially with how challenging that's been over the last few years in this industry, among others. And when possible, let's find ways to make this bipartisan. I know Nelson mentioned Iowa earlier, but there are other states where we've seen conservative policymakers that have introduced really strong potential policies. And Indiana and Nebraska in this last legislative session are two good examples, as well as what's happening still in Iowa. So I will stop there and thank everybody for listening. I think we probably are moving into Q&A, Molly, and I'm excited for that.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yes, we are. And thanks everyone for submitting questions. We have some really good ones in the queue here. Feel free to keep them rolling. But yeah, Bradley, Nelson, really appreciate these overviews. My first question here is from Rachel. She's keen to hear more from Nelson about why passing favorable siting reforms has been so challenging. So could you unpack the broad dynamics at play here, whether that's political, coalitional, I've never heard that word before, coalitional, technical, etc.
Yeah, well, great question. I think there's a lot of reasons. I think first and foremost, and relevant to the discussion here, I think we haven't had really good policy solutions to bring to folks. And the solutions set has really been constrained to a couple different ideas, and it's been challenging to get the right folks in the room, that coalition you mentioned, and really settle on, okay, what are the actual barriers and challenges, and how do we design the policy in a way that addresses the political environment? And that brings me to the other huge challenge you mentioned, which is in a lot of these states, the politics for getting this kind of legislation passed is really tricky. As we all know, renewable energy has been really vilified in some circles, and it makes it challenging to pass through some through purple and red houses in the legislature. And so there's a lot of jockeying that needs to happen there. And then there's also some dynamics from more like left-leaning environmental groups where, as I mentioned in Pennsylvania, there's a tendency if the group isn't getting everything they want in a legislative proposal to torpedo it. And so there's these dynamics on the left and the right that are causing these kinds of tensions. And then, yeah, I think also from the coalitional perspective, folks can kind of get wrapped around the axle of making the perfect the enemy of the good and not really advancing a policy solution that actually addresses the critical issues. So it's a cop-out, of course, but it's genuinely all of the above. It's a lot harder to pass something than to stop something from getting passed. Also, that's the last thing. It's like the status quo is always easier to defend. And then, I'm sorry, one more thing is that local in a lot of these cases, in balancing authorities between state and local governments, you're often shifting some authority from local governments to a state entity, and local governments tend to really jealously guard that siting and permitting authority, and the ability to make those land use decisions. And so it automatically raises their hackles and creates a really challenging dynamic that policymakers have to navigate in the legislature. So those are all the reasons, and there's probably dozens more.
You're making it sound really hard to pass good state level permit reform, Nelson. Not a good pep talk for the folks in the room. But a fantastic segue into this next question we got from Brian, which unfortunately is not any easier to answer, but I'm super curious to hear what folks have to say. I have some thoughts as well. So from Brian, how do you put bumpers on local restrictions without also restricting the ability of communities to build in local benefits, including priorities for brownfield development, environmentally sensitive design, local benefit ordinances, etc.? Several of the states that passed good siting standards also cut local government's ability to implement best practices in siting and design and community benefits.
Yeah.
Who wants to start?
I'll share, some of our experiences with the Michigan law as it's being implemented right now, because from how I understand it, I mean, certainly there are restrictions and obligations authority having jurisdictions have within the CREOs, but we've also seen instances of developers working directly with the permitting body to create something that is workable and might go beyond or just below what might be required for them. And as long as both parties seem acceptable to that or it's agreeable, they can kind of move forward. And that's been the case on not just sort of like the raw permitting parts of it too, but with say like community benefits agreements and working on the particular permit application. And I think the law was designed that way as well to kind of incentivize developers working directly with the counties, with the state public service commission being that backstop. So I think there's a way that you can kind of do both of, having something that ensures that there is durability in a place that developers can pivot to, in this case, the MPSC, or also incentivizing through CBAs and other things, the process of working directly with the community itself.
Cool. Nelson, do you want to go or do you want me to hop in?
Yeah, I'll add a couple more things. Along with CBAs, enabling development agreements, I think, is another approach to allow for some of those negotiations to take place between local governments and developers. But I think this is a really good question, and it points to a challenge that we've seen in Illinois, where after a piece of legislation is passed, legislatures have to kind of revisit them over time, and it points to like the iterative process of policymaking, where you have to really figure out where the sweet spot is, and it may take a few bites of the apple to really find the right balance of state and local authority, because you want to try to constrain arbitrarily restrictive local ordinances, but enable that flexibility. So I think Illinois going back and passing SURJA in November 2025 is a good example of how they're trying to address this issue, because it is a significant one, Brian.
Yeah, I agree. I think, the idea of being the group that's advocating to take away local community voices on this issue, like, is not the side we want to be on. I don't think that is a strong position in general. So I think it's more, I think about that there's a role for state permitting, which is providing clarity and confidence to developers to understand the role that local permitting plays and putting some small guardrails there. But I think there's a lot of groups that are working on building community support, communicating to county level, like residents about benefits. Like, there's a lot of stuff happening so that when a developer gets into a room and is speaking with these communities, that they are like winning that room. And then there's a separate thing that I think we're working on now, which is like just the bureaucracy, the process at the state level of making sure that it's as clear and streamlined as possible, without that does not take away from the local residents' ability to have a say in what gets built there. So in a kind of cop-out way, I think it's like, why not both? Okay. other questions? I just had one pulled up. Um, where should a state begin if they are not sure what challenges that they're facing or should be selecting within the power tool? And I know this is about the power tool. I'm happy to answer for that specifically, but do you guys have a question or should I kick off or an answer?
I can follow you. Go ahead, Molly.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I was going to start with saying that the most important thing, as I alluded to earlier, and what we're starting to provide in terms of support to states is like really understanding where your barriers are. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. And actually, I think in my answer, I'll shout out a few different organizations and solutions they're suggesting. One is I just spoke with with EPIC, the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, yesterday about ways that technology and just like basic project management and tracking tools can really help states that are currently reliant on just like an emailed process or even a paper process get into a place where they're understanding transparently how long each step is taking and where folks are hitting bottlenecks. I think there's so much that we just don't know about what stages in each state are taking too long. And so like even just a preliminary step of let's get the data on what steps are taking how long and where agency staff are under capacity or aren't given the resources they need to like keep the process moving. I think having that information will really help design a better process fundamentally. Speaking with both the developers in the state and county level officials to really get a better sense of where, where they're facing friction and where there's, these restrictive feelings are coming from, or the feelings that are creating the need to pass restrictive policies. Like I think there's a lot of tension that has been spoken to a lot here today between state officials taking away local power. And so really understanding that. And then finally, learning from where states have misdiagnosed problems and what has happened because of that can be hugely impactful and educational for states that are just starting. So there's a grid strategies paper that came out, I think, last month that looked at learnings from Washington, California, Illinois, New York. And I think that paper can be really useful to see like, okay, if you thought you were solving for this problem and you did this, here's what might happen. Those are some preliminary thoughts. Anyone want to add?
I think that's a great answer, Molly. I don't really have much more to add. I think it does from someone like me at Citing Solutions Project who works in a bunch of different states. It's really you really have to dive deep with the folks who are embedded in the state and those coalitions to plumb that question. And it takes a lot of time to get to that first step of like, okay, what are the actual barriers and what are we solving for here? And I think you have to know what the existing authorities and structures are at the outset to know what you potentially need to change. And I think that's another good starting point.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, I think we have time for one more. I see this one. I think this could be answered by probably either of you. So how do you translate policies from one state to another when the politics and challenges may differ?
Well, to shill for the tool, I think that's a good place to start. Is like it's a great tool, and I think that learning from particularly the policies that are the inputs in the legislation is a really good first start. But I think that the place where folks can learn a lot more from like missteps and challenges is watching how the implementation shook out and seeing exactly and seeing exactly how the state kind of faltered or where they had to go back to the drawing board and taking pieces from that process, because seeing how the rubber meets the road, I think from somebody who is responsible for helping that process roll through can oftentimes be a lot more important than even getting the legislation right, because it's a lot harder to put some of that stuff back in the box after it's already been rolled out to some of these communities, as opposed to something that's as simple as a legislative fix.
I would just add that this is where every state is very unique and is its own special snowflake. That's very true, and every policy needs to be tailored to the state's context. There is no one size fits all solution here. And at the same time, we can take these different policy concepts from maybe analogous or similar states and sketch out, bulleted policy solutions, and that's where you have to start with coalition members, with advocates working in states to really dive deep into what pieces you can pick and choose from to roll into an actual policy reform. Yeah, so I guess that's the way that I think about it.
Awesome. Thank you both. I think that's a fabulous place to end. Huge thank you to Nelson and Bradley for sharing their deep knowledge of this topic. Really appreciate it. And to all of you for joining us. As I said, I know I've reiterated this 1,000 times, recording and resources from this webinar will be shared along with at least my email and maybe Nelson and Bradley's as well, if we get their permission. So if we didn't get to your question, or if, again, you're interested in partnering on anything that the three of us discussed today, please do reach out. So thank you again for hanging out with us for the last hour, and hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.